Thomas Jefferson sat in the president's house in the spring of 1801, reading yet another report of American sailors being enslaved on the Barbary coast of North Africa, and made a decision that would fundamentally change America's relationship with the world. For decades, the United States had been paying tribute, essentially protection money, to the Barbary states of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli to prevent these North African pirates from capturing American merchant ships and enslaving their crews. The payments were enormous, consuming up to 20% of the federal budget. The humiliation was worse. Here was the young United States, having just won independence from the world's greatest empire, now paying ransom to petty pirate kingdoms to avoid having its citizens sold into slavery. Jefferson decided enough was enough. He would send the United States Navy to the Mediterranean to fight the pirates. He would launch America's first foreign war, and he would do it without asking Congress for a formal declaration of war, establishing a precedent for executive military action that presidents would invoke for the next 2 centuries. The question that echoes through American history is not merely whether Jefferson was right to fight the pirates, but whether he was right to do so without Congress, and what his decision tells us about presidential power, national honor, and the price of freedom. To understand why Jefferson launched a war against Barbary pirates, we must first comprehend the extraordinary power these North African states wielded over Mediterranean commerce in the late 18th century. The Barbary states, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, controlled the North African coastline from the Atlantic to Egypt. Their fleets of swift-sailing ships, manned by experienced corsairs, preyed on merchant vessels throughout the Mediterranean and even ventured into the Atlantic. These were not random bandits or disorganized criminals. They were state-sponsored enterprises, with the rulers of these territories licensing corsair captains, taking a share of captured goods and ransom payments, and using piracy as a central component of their economies and foreign policy. The system worked with brutal efficiency. Barbary corsairs would intercept merchant ships, overwhelm their crews through superior numbers and firepower, and seize the vessels, cargo, and crew. European and American sailors captured by the pirates faced a grim fate. They would be brought to North African ports and sold into slavery. Some became galley slaves, chained to oars on Barbary vessels. Others became laborers, working in quarries or on construction projects under brutal conditions. A fortunate few might be held for ransom, with their families or governments negotiating payments for their release. The threat was constant and terrifying. Any ship entering the Mediterranean risked capture, and the consequences were not merely economic but personal and horrifying. European powers had long since made their accommodation with this system. Britain, France, Spain, and other maritime nations paid annual tribute to the Barbary states, cash payments, naval stores, weapons, and other goods, in exchange for safe passage for their merchant ships. The payments were substantial, but these wealthy empires calculated that tribute was cheaper than constant war. Moreover, the Barbary threat actually benefited established European powers by making Mediterranean trade dangerous for smaller nations without the resources to pay tribute or maintain significant naval forces. The system thus reinforced the dominance of major European maritime powers while extracting wealth from North African rulers who had found a profitable way to exploit their strategic position. The United States faced this system from a position of weakness. As British colonies, American ships had been protected by British tribute payments and the Royal Navy. But when the United States won independence in 1783, that protection vanished. American merchant vessels now sailed as the ships of a new, weak nation with no treaties, no tribute agreements, and no naval force capable of protecting them. The Barbary states immediately recognized an opportunity. In 1784, Moroccan corsairs seized the American merchant ship Betsy. In 1785, Algerian pirates captured 2 more American vessels and enslaved their crews, 21 American sailors who would spend more than a decade in captivity. The response from the young United States was characterized by confusion, impotence, and humiliation. The government under the Articles of Confederation had no money and no navy. Congress could only watch helplessly as American citizens were enslaved and American commerce was strangled. Individual states tried to negotiate their own arrangements, but lacked the authority and resources to succeed. The crisis revealed the fundamental weakness of the Articles of Confederation and contributed to the movement to create a stronger federal government under the Constitution. Even after the Constitution was ratified and the federal government was strengthened, the response to Barbary piracy remained one of accommodation rather than resistance. President George Washington's administration negotiated tribute treaties with the Barbary states. In 1796, the United States signed a treaty with Tripoli that included a payment of $56,000 plus an annual tribute. Similar agreements were reached with Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco. The payments were staggering. In the 1790s, the United States paid approximately $1 million in cash and naval stores to Algiers alone, roughly one-sixth of the entire federal budget. Some of the ransomed American sailors had been in captivity for more than 10 years. The payments and the humiliation infuriated many Americans, including Thomas Jefferson. As early as 1785, when Jefferson was minister to France, he had argued that the United States should fight the Barbary pirates rather than pay them tribute. Jefferson believed that paying tribute only encouraged further demands, that it was economically unsustainable, and that it was morally degrading for a free republic to submit to extortion. In a letter to John Adams in 1786, Jefferson wrote that he preferred war to tribute. "I should prefer the obtaining of peace by war," he explained, rather than by purchase, arguing that fighting would cost less in the long run and would establish the principle that America would not be extorted. But Jefferson's views remained minority positions during the Washington and Adams administrations. Most American leaders, recognizing the young nation's military weakness, preferred accommodation to conflict. The United States had no significant navy. Building one would be expensive and time-consuming. Moreover, war with the Barbary states might provoke other conflicts, possibly drawing in European powers with their own interests in the region. Paying tribute seemed like an unfortunate but necessary reality of international commerce for a weak nation. The situation changed when Jefferson became president in March 1801. Jefferson had never accepted the tribute system as permanent or legitimate. He believed in American honor and refused to accept the idea that the United States would indefinitely pay protection money to pirate states. Moreover, Jefferson saw an opportunity. In the years since those early debates, the United States had begun building a navy. The Naval Act of 1794 had authorized construction of 6 frigates, and several of these powerful warships were now operational. Jefferson believed America now had the capability to challenge the Barbary states militarily. The provocation came quickly. In May 1801, just 2 months into Jefferson's presidency, Yusuf Karamanli, the Pasha of Tripoli, demanded an immediate payment of $225,000 plus annual tribute of $25,000. This was an enormous sum, far exceeding previous arrangements. When the United States refused, Tripoli declared war by the traditional method of chopping down the flagpole at the American consulate. It was a symbolic gesture, but the message was clear. Tripoli would resume attacks on American shipping, but Jefferson's response was immediate and decisive. Without waiting for Congress to formally declare war, indeed, without even asking for such a declaration, Jefferson ordered a naval squadron to the Mediterranean. The squadron consisted of 3 frigates and 1 schooner, a small force, but one that represented a significant commitment of American naval power. The ships were commanded by Commodore Richard Dale, an experienced naval officer who had served under John Paul Jones during the Revolutionary War. Jefferson's orders were carefully calibrated. The squadron was to protect American commerce, but could only engage in defensive actions unless Congress declared war. Yet the practical effect was clear. America was going to war with Tripoli. This decision to use military force without a congressional declaration of war was extraordinary and constitutionally questionable. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress the power to declare war. The founders had been clear that they did not want presidents to have the unilateral power to initiate military conflicts, having seen how European monarchs launched wars for personal or dynastic reasons. The power to declare war was deliberately placed with the legislature to ensure that the people's representatives, not a single executive, would make such momentous decisions. Yet Jefferson, despite being a strict constructionist who generally interpreted the Constitution narrowly and opposed expansive presidential power, was now claiming the authority to wage war without Congress. His justification was that he was responding to a declaration of war by Tripoli and was therefore acting defensively. But this was a thin rationale. Tripoli's declaration was symbolic, chopping down a flagpole, and the American response was an offensive military expedition to North African waters. If this was defensive action, the category had become almost meaningless. The First Barbary War, as it came to be called, lasted from 1801 to 1805 and revealed both the promise and the problems of Jefferson's approach to presidential power and military action. The naval campaign unfolded over several years with mixed results. The first squadron under Commodore Dale achieved little beyond blockading Tripoli's harbor and protecting some American merchant vessels. Dale's successor, Commodore Richard Morris, performed even worse, failing to take decisive action and eventually being recalled in disgrace. It was not until Commodore Edward Preble took command in 1803 that American forces began to seriously challenge Tripoli. Preble brought energy, skill, and aggressive tactics to the conflict. His squadron bombarded Tripoli's fortifications, engaged Tripolitan gunboats in close-quarters combat, and imposed a tight blockade on the port. The most dramatic action came in February 1804, when Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led a daring raid into Tripoli's harbor. The previous October, the American frigate Philadelphia had run aground while pursuing Tripolitan vessels and was captured along with its crew of 307 men. The ship represented a significant loss to the American Navy and a potential gain for Tripoli if it could be repaired and put into service. Decatur and a small crew disguised themselves as local sailors, sailed into the heavily defended harbor on a captured vessel, boarded the Philadelphia, overpowered the guard, set the ship ablaze, and escaped. British Admiral Lord Nelson called it the most bold and daring act of the age. Yet even these successes could not force Tripoli to surrender. The bombardments and blockades hurt Tripoli's economy and demonstrated American resolve, but did not threaten the Pasha's regime. The Philadelphia's crew remained captive, hostages to ongoing negotiations. The war seemed to be reaching a stalemate, with neither side capable of decisively defeating the other. American forces could raid and harass, but lacked the capability to invade and conquer. Tripoli could not defeat the American Navy, but could endure the blockade and wait for American patience to run out. Into this stalemate walked one of the most extraordinary characters in early American history, William Eaton, a former Army captain who conceived an audacious plan to overthrow the Pasha of Tripoli and replace him with his brother. Eaton's scheme was breathtaking in its ambition and borderline insane in its execution. He proposed to find Hamid Karamanli, the Pasha's older brother who had been deposed and was in exile in Egypt, recruit an army, march across 500 miles of North African desert, and attack Tripoli from land while the American Navy attacked from the sea. This plan had numerous problems. It required finding and convincing an exiled prince, recruiting and leading an army of Arabs, Berbers, and European mercenaries who had no loyalty to America, crossing one of the harshest deserts in the world, and coordinating with the Navy in an era before radio communications. Incredibly, Eaton made it work. He found Hamid in Egypt, recruited a polyglot force of about 500 men including 8 U.S. Marines, the origin of the phrase "to the shores of Tripoli" in the Marine Corps hymn, and began the march across the Libyan desert in March 1805. The expedition was a nightmare of thirst, starvation, mutiny, and battles with hostile forces. Eaton's force nearly disintegrated multiple times, held together only by his force of personality and occasional payments of money that he promised but didn't always have. On April 27, 1805, Eaton's ragtag army, supported by bombardment from American naval vessels, captured the city of Derna, giving the United States its first victory on foreign soil. The capture of Derna shocked the Pasha of Tripoli. Suddenly, the conflict was no longer merely a naval blockade that could be endured, but an existential threat to his rule. His brother had an army, had captured a major city, and appeared to have American support for taking the throne. The Pasha quickly agreed to negotiate. In June 1805, a treaty was signed ending the war. The terms were mixed. The United States agreed to pay $60,000 for the release of the Philadelphia's crew, but would pay no further annual tribute. Tripoli agreed to peace and to stop capturing American vessels. Jefferson and his supporters proclaimed the treaty a great victory. America had fought rather than paid, had demonstrated its willingness to use force to protect its interests, and had freed American captives. The annual tribute system was ended, at least with Tripoli. Yet the treaty was not the complete triumph Jefferson might have wished. The United States still paid a ransom for the Philadelphia's crew. American forces withdrew, abandoning Ham at Karamanli and leaving him to flee back into exile. And while Tripoli's tribute demands ended, the other Barbary states, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco, continued to receive payments. The constitutional questions raised by Jefferson's conduct of the war were never clearly resolved. Jefferson had launched military operations without a congressional declaration of war. Congress had appropriated money for the naval expedition and had passed legislation regarding captured vessels and prisoners, which could be seen as implicit approval of the conflict. But Congress never formally declared war. This created an ambiguous precedent. Presidents could use military force in what they characterized as defensive or limited operations without congressional declarations, while Congress could implicitly authorize military action through appropriations and legislation without formally declaring war. This ambiguity would haunt American constitutional practice for the next 2 centuries. Jefferson's actions established a precedent that presidents would invoke repeatedly to justify military operations without congressional declarations of war. The quasi-war with France under John Adams, military expeditions against Native American tribes, intervention in Latin America, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, interventions in the Middle East, drone strikes, and countless other military actions. The Barbary War showed that a president could commit American forces to combat, sustain that combat for years, and claim to be acting within constitutional bounds without a formal declaration of war. The immediate aftermath of the First Barbary War seemed to validate Jefferson's approach. American prestige increased. The Barbary states had learned that the United States would fight rather than be extorted indefinitely. American naval power had been demonstrated, yet the peace was fragile and partial. In 1807, Algiers resumed capturing American ships. The tribute system was not fully ended until after the War of 1812, when President James Madison sent a squadron under Commodore Stephen Decatur to the Mediterranean. Decatur's expedition, backed by America's enhanced naval power after the War of 1812, forced new treaties that ended tribute payments entirely and secured better terms for American commerce. The Barbary Wars, both the First Barbary War under Jefferson and the Second Barbary War under Madison, represent a crucial moment in American history. They marked the first significant projection of American military power overseas, the first sustained military operations in foreign territory, and the first test of how the young republic would conduct foreign policy and military affairs. The conflicts revealed both the promise and the peril of American power, the ability to protect American interests and citizens abroad, but also the temptation to use force unilaterally without proper constitutional process. Jefferson's decision to wage war against the Barbary pirates without congressional declaration also reveals deep contradictions in his political philosophy. Throughout his career, Jefferson had been the champion of limited government, strict construction of the Constitution, and legislative supremacy. He had opposed Alexander Hamilton's expansive interpretation of federal power. He had criticized President Adams for expanding executive authority. Yet when Jefferson himself became president and faced a crisis he considered urgent, he exercised executive power in ways that exceeded his own constitutional principles. The contradiction is striking. Jefferson the theorist believed in limited presidential power. Jefferson the president claimed the authority to wage war without Congress. This contradiction was not unique to military affairs. Jefferson's presidency was filled with such tensions. The man who had argued for the strict construction of the Constitution purchased the Louisiana Territory without clear constitutional authority. The champion of individual liberty maintained slavery at Monticello and did nothing as president to challenge the institution. The advocate for limited federal power expanded executive authority in multiple domains. Jefferson in power was a different creature from Jefferson in opposition. The Barbary Wars also raised questions about the relationship between national honor and rational policy. Jefferson's decision to fight rather than pay tribute was motivated significantly by concerns about honor and respect. He found it humiliating for the United States to pay protection money to pirate states. He believed that accommodation invited further extortion. He wanted America to be respected as a sovereign nation that would defend its interests forcefully. These concerns about honor were not trivial or merely symbolic. They reflected genuine beliefs about national character and international standing. Yet honor is expensive. The Barbary Wars cost millions of dollars, diverted naval resources from other priorities, risked sailors' lives, and created diplomatic complications. A cold cost-benefit analysis might have concluded that continuing to pay tribute would have been cheaper and less risky than war. The tribute payments, though large, were predictable and finite. War costs were unpredictable and potentially unlimited. Moreover, war risked failure, which would be more humiliating than payment. Jefferson's decision to fight was as much about values, honor, sovereignty, refusal to submit to extortion, as about rational calculation of costs and benefits. This tension between honor and calculation remains relevant in contemporary foreign policy. How much should a nation risk to maintain its reputation? When does concern for honor or prestige lead to sound policy? And when does it lead to overreach and disaster? The Barbary Wars suggest that honor and interests are not always aligned, and that decisions about war and peace involve value judgments that transcend mere calculation. The legacy of Jefferson's war against the Barbary pirates extends far beyond the immediate results. The conflict established the United States Navy as a fighting force capable of operating far from home. It gave the Marines their first famous victory and established their reputation for amphibious operations. It demonstrated that the United States would use force to protect its commercial interests and citizens abroad. It showed that American power could reach across oceans and influence events in distant regions. In these ways, the Barbary Wars were a prelude to American emergence as a global power in the 20th century. Yet the wars also established precedents for presidential war-making that have proven deeply problematic. Jefferson's decision to conduct military operations without congressional declaration of war opened a door that has never been closed. Subsequent presidents have invoked Jefferson's example to justify military actions of increasing scope and duration without formal declarations of war. The ambiguity about what constitutes defensive action, about how limited operations can become before congressional authorization is required, about the respective war powers of President and Congress. These questions, first raised by Jefferson's Barbary War, remain unresolved and contentious more than 2 centuries later. Thomas Jefferson, sitting in the President's house in 1801, reading reports of enslaved American sailors and deciding to send the Navy to fight pirates, began something larger than he probably imagined. He initiated America's long career as a military power operating globally. He established patterns of presidential authority that would shape American governance for centuries. He demonstrated American willingness to use force to protect its interests and citizens. He showed that young republic would not accept humiliation indefinitely, that it would fight when its honor was challenged, and that it would make its own decisions about when and how to use military force, regardless of constitutional niceties or international opinion. The Barbary pirates who had preyed on American shipping, who had enslaved American sailors, who had extorted tribute from the young United States, learned that this new nation was different from European powers they had exploited for generations. America would pay for a time, would negotiate and accommodate, but would ultimately fight. The question of whether Jefferson was right to fight without congressional declaration remains contested. The fact that he did so, and that his decision shaped the trajectory of American power for 2 centuries, is undeniable. The war against the Barbary pirates was America's announcement that it would be a different kind of nation, one that protected its commerce globally, that used force when necessary, and that would establish its own rules for how such force would be employed. For better and worse, that announcement has echoed through American history ever since.